Hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning in for this All Tech is Human event called From First Internship to First Job, Getting Started in Responsible Tech. We're very excited that you're here. We have a really big crowd tuning in because I think a lot of people want to know, especially college students, but anyone starting out in these spaces wants to know how to get started in the field. If we had a second subtitle for today's event, it would be the changing landscape of the responsible tech career and how you can use your communication skills to learn about it. Because that's what our two main guests here today are actually going to be speaking to. Professor Deb Donig, who is Assistant Professor of English Literature at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, is going to be talking about a study that she did, an NSF-funded study that she did, scoping out the changing landscape of responsible tech careers, especially in the past 5 years, with a transition around 2022. You'll hear about that in just a few moments. And then Professor Alex Johnston of Georgetown University, who is an associate professor of practice in the Department of Linguistics and is in charge of career placement in the Department of Linguistics at Georgetown University, will actually talk about how to use your social science skills or your natural communication skills to figure out how to fit within the responsible tech space. Asking the questions today are going to be some amazing students from the All Tech is Human University Network. If you are a university student out there and you'd like to get involved in our network, you'd like to start a club on your campus and bring All Tech is Human's amazing content to your campus, reach out to me. I'm Stephen Kelts, Stephen@alltechishuman.org, and we'll get you signed up and we'll get a club started on your campus. People who are going to be asking questions today are, to start, Desiree, who is a public policy student at UVA. We also have Milan Wiertz, who is a political science student at University of British Columbia and Sciences Po in Paris. We have Katie Bernard, who's a computer science and creative writing student at Colby College. Love to see those combinations. And joining us soon, I hope, is Niki Harris, a public policy student at Carleton University in beautiful Ottawa. And without further ado, then, we want to get started with our questions. So we're going to speak first to Professor Donig about what she has learned about the changing landscape of responsible tech careers. And our first question will come from Desiree Ho. Take it away.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Kelts. So our first question is, in presentations you've given about your NSF research study, you identified the year 2022 as a major turning point in the responsible tech space. Why so? What happened that year to change the landscape?
Well, this is a fantastic question. And I actually want to, before I get into what happened in 2020, really a landmark moment, really take us back to the first critical moment, I think, in the responsible tech, ethical tech, public interest tech movement. And that is 2016. And in 2016, we should all recall, with an election coming up in November, 2016 was the election of Donald Trump. Many people who had previously been very excited about our new tech overlords started to be very concerned about some of the unintended or perhaps intentionally ignored consequences of technology. This was a moment, if we can go back to 8 years ago now and draw this up from the memory hole, a moment where people were really concerned about the manipulation of political discourse on social media. This was a moment of Cambridge Analytica. This was a moment where people were really concerned about deep fakes, disinformation, misinformation. And so in that moment, and along with the election of Donald Trump, which seemed to threaten a lot of social norms around social justice, there was a movement that spawned up that I like to call a techlash, that is to say a backlash against the negative consequences of technology. And in that moment, you really saw a kind of activist movement rise up, an attempt to protect and to augment dimensions of diversity, equity, inclusion, to provide some checks and balances and speak some truth to power when it came to the unintended consequences, the intentionally ignored consequences of technology and the negative consequences of technology writ large. This was also the moment of EU introducing the GDPR, new protections, new forms of consequential legislation emerging to try and protect society against some of those harms. But what really happened between that period of time in 2022 was that rise of what I like to call an activist movement around social justice and ethical, responsible public interest technology. In 2022, we can recall another landmark moment which is that Elon Musk bought Twitter. And in that moment, he fired his trust and safety team, really contracted a lot of the protections and a lot of that kind of a more activist set of occupations around ethics, technology, public interest. And what this did was it sent a signal to other companies that you could do this. You could fire entire trust and safety, governance, DEI teams and still report a profitable model for your business. And so other tech companies followed suit with that. This was in addition to, and I'll just briefly touch on this, a contraction in the market and a contraction in capital available for companies where they needed to, as they saw it, tighten their belts a little bit. And the first to go were these protective, ethical, responsible technology jobs. And so what you really saw is a lot of job precarity, or that is to say, dispensability to some of those jobs. And so with that dissolution of trust and safety teams, you really kind of saw a lot of the jobs that had risen up between 2016 and 2022 start to dissipate. But 2022 also represented another landmark moment, and that is the introduction of President Biden and the Biden administration's executive order on AI. And a really new way of thinking about civil rights connected to ethical and responsible technology, and the production of certain legislation that promised contracts to, or limited contracts and government funding to companies based on their willingness to participate in responsible AI procedures. And so what we see in 2022, just to kind of wrap this together, is a new second wave of public interest in responsible technology jobs. If we want to call the first wave activist jobs, social justice oriented toward making sort of public proclamations and developing new public facing approaches to diversity, equity, inclusion, and responsible technology. I want to say wave two, or responsible technology, ethical technology, public interest technology, whatever you want to call it, 2.0, was really focused on developing streamlines of procedures and organizational capacities. In other words, operationalizing ethical technology, responsible technology across an organization in a way that said, rather than having this activist model that was a little bit adversarial, let's create a model where we can actually use ethical technology operations in order to attract customers, to speed the shipping of products up. And that kind of reorganization, I think, is where we are now. And the larger ambition of an ethical technology role right now is to create measurable, objective standards by which we can, before we get into product development, even ideate and think about templates and operationalize ethical, responsible models that can actually provide a market advantage and can actually speed up processes, can actually make things smoother in terms of shipping a product or getting a product out, or operationalizing an ethical approach to accessible technologies, for example.
Yeah, thank you so much for that recap of the history. So I was wondering, given all those events, how exactly do you interpret those changes? Was this a retraction for responsible tech careers, or did the jobs available in this space simply take on a different form?
It's an excellent question. What we saw originally was a contraction in those jobs, right? I started to see a lot of people who had previously been part of these teams sort of looking for new jobs. And now I think we're starting to see an expansion, but those jobs don't look the same as they used to look. Those jobs are actually doing something very different in terms of where, for example, they're placed in the organization. So, for example, rather than having a DEI team or a trust and safety team, you actually have people thinking about responsible technology lodged in different departments, working with departments across an organization. From my point of view, this is actually beneficial for an ethical technology model. And the reason that it's beneficial is that one of the things that happened when I spoke to experts and people who had been critics of ethics of technology in my National Science Foundation study, is they were very critical of a structure where a company had set up, for example, a DEI team or an ethics team that really wasn't in conversation with these other teams. They were kind of a silo. They were talking to one another rather than to the larger team. And so I just want to draw out a quote from one of my participants in that study, a CEO of a company at the time that was majorly doing some work to combat some of the unethical things that were happening in their company. This is just one quote. If you or I are on one team, let's say in a big company, it's very difficult to learn what's happening about in other areas of the company. And then we would have the best, wonderful micro practices on our ethics team, and it would never be shared or replicated anywhere else. And this means that due to size, people get left behind. We don't know how to escalate an internal issue to a company-wide issue. Nothing ever gets addressed or mitigated. Across a lot of different sectors, whether it's the engineering side, policy, a number of teams, there doesn't seem to be a structure of governance that ultimately can go company-wide. Whereas now where you have an ethical, responsible person situated across different teams, streamlined across an entire organization, you get rid of some of that hierarchy. And so you can catch problems earlier on. You can create and operationalize the answers to those problems before they actually become problems embedded in an actual technology.
I think some college students might be wondering, you say that responsible tech careers reorganized and the roles shift to cross different parts of an organization. What skills do we need to be ready for those sort of cross-organizational jobs?
Yeah, this is a really excellent question. And here I think that there's a real opportunity for students to gain skills right now that can make them lead, not just participants in this workforce, but actual leaders in the tech industry. What my study suggested was a kind of approach. People in industry right now are asking for people to approach technology, able to, so to speak, multiple languages, to be able to come and speak the language of a technical team, but also to speak the language of ethics, and also to have some knowledge about the laws and legislations and regulation and in that space as well. And so from my perspective right now, we are training students with a 19th century European model to speak a 21st century language. And I think that that has to change. Now, institutions are notoriously slow, bureaucratic, and really have a difficult time changing with the times. But as students, you can change with the times, and to change with those times, we need to think about solving larger problems than what an individual discipline typically allows you to be able to think in terms of. The problems that we are dealing with in terms of the tech industry are so large and so multifaceted and so multidimensional that we need different perspectives to come to the table. Now, this is a problem about how do we organize teams, but individually, if you can learn some basic coding, some basic technical language, if you can learn how to understand the history of ideas, if you can learn some approaches to policy or governance and have that framework moving in to the industry, you're really going to be powerful in terms of your job achievement capacities. And so the goal here, and what I would urge and advocate students to do, is think outside of the traditional major, right? Draw from whatever major you're in and build outside of it, because the problems that you're going to be asked to think about require that kind of multifaceted skill. Again, the universities need to get with the times too. My hope is that we can change that. But think in terms of what area of interest or what problem you want to solve, and take all the classes that you can that can help you find different approaches from different technical dimensions, political dimensions, historical dimensions to that problem, right? If you're interested in climate change, think about taking a class on climate change technology. Think about taking a class in the history of climate change or eco-criticism. Think about taking a class in biology. And if you can wrap that together, you have an enormous capacity to make a foundational change in the industry.
Thanks so much for sharing. So we just heard that the responsible tech career space has really changed a lot recently. And we've heard a little bit about the new skills that we might need in this space. So we'd now like to turn to Alex to ask a few questions on how we might be able to access our first opportunity in responsible tech. And so first things first, Alex, your background is in social linguistics. That's a lens you use to teach students how to communicate with professionals and to learn about their roles. Can you explain what social linguistics is and what sort of communications situations you studied?
Yes, thanks so much, Milan. So First of all, linguistics is the scientific study of language. And sociolinguistics really puts the emphasis on language in society and how we use language in the world to do things. And when you think about it, we use language to do things, all the things in the world. We need it to mediate everything we do. So being able to study the intersection of language, society, and culture is one of the most fascinating things, because it can lead you into many different situations that you can drill down and look at the linguistic patterns that underlie communication. So the communicative situations that I tend to study focus on language in the workplace and focus on the language of work. And as Professor Donig just brought up, we need to be fluent in a number of varieties of language. And I can really drill down on that and show us all how we can pick up on some of those keywords from different sectors so that we can make ourselves more competitive and more understanding and more fluent in how to bridge communication differences across sectors, such as government, industry, nonprofit, and higher ed, but also within organizations, which again have many business units that make up the organization and many different languages associated with those business units. So the work that I tend to do, again, is focusing on language patterns and communication patterns in ways that we work, ways that we find work, the way that we find opportunities, and the way that we interact with people in the process of finding a career fit and finding career opportunities.
So Alex, I'll ask the next question. It's a shame that we don't have Niki Harris of Carleton University with us here. Some technical difficulties kept her from tuning in. But as the participants know, and as everyone at home should know, the students did all the research and devised all the questions for this. So this is actually a question from Niki. She was very interested in courses that you teach that teach social science students how they can transition into careers after their social sciencey education. And one of the things you teach about is informational interviewing. And she wanted to know, is informational interviewing, is that the kind of dreaded like networking that college students feel so uncomfortable about? What's your main piece of advice about informational interviewing?
Perfect. And Niki came up with such great questions that I hope I can answer them to her satisfaction. I'll look forward to feedback from Niki. But to put it into context, first of all, I have taught a career management class for primarily linguists and other social scientists for the past 6 years. I also teach career management to people in academia who transition into other sectors like business, government, nonprofit, tech, and media. And so I teach a career management methodology, which is not rocket science. It's something we can all learn and make use of throughout the stages of our life and throughout different career stages. Part of learning a career management method is learning how to network. And I tend to start a lot of my classes with a networking for people who hate networking workshop, because a lot of people have very negative associations with networking. And this is going to lead to informational interviewing. But to get to networking first, if you have negative associations with networking, I get it. I understand. If you're an introvert and you feel like this is something that is not made for me, I understand. I'm an introvert too. Here's the thing. Networking is anything that you want it to be, anything you like. If you like research and learning, that is what networking is, with people being your data and people being the sources of information that you can use in your career search. If you like advocating for friends and connecting your friends with other people, and you're that connector kind of person who is perhaps a bit reticent about advocating for yourself, but you think, oh, I know just the person that my friend should connect with, and you put those two people together and you set them up to have a conversation, that's networking. And doing that kind of good in the world by connecting your friends with resources and other people will come back to you. So networking is necessary, but you can call it something else. First rule of networking, don't call it networking. Call it research, call it learning, call it making a friend, call it having a career chat, call it just a conversation. It can be a conversation in a driveway in the street. It can be a conversation at an airport restaurant. I've had these kinds of career conversations anywhere you can imagine. They're basically on-ramps to potential relationships, potential mutually beneficial exchange. Networking is not extractive. Networking at its finest, or learning about other people and what they do in their work lives, is meant to be mutually beneficial. So networking can be a means to an end in terms of informational interviewing and finding people to have an informational interview with. So for those of you who haven't heard this term, informational interviewing, it's a thing. It's a named genre of interaction that working professionals make use of in the world to learn. Again, this is a research tool. If you like research, then this is your way to do research on your own interests and your own connection with the world of work. So don't be scared about connecting with people and asking for an informational interview. We'll talk a little bit later about how to do that in a non-awkward, non-threatening way. But to let you know, informational interviewing is meant to be just that. You are talking to someone who is a bit more further along in their career than you, and you are asking about their career path, about their work and how they got there, about the skills that they have that they make use of all the time in their job, about how the sector works, about how their organization works, about the projects that they're working on, about responsible tech and their role in it, and how they connect with other people in other parts of the organization or the sector in order to do the work of responsible tech. And what does that mean? So it's your chance to ask for information and learn more. Learn things that you can't find online. Learn things that you can't find on that organizational website. It's a chance to talk to somebody about their personal experience. So you're not asking for a job. You are not currently actively applying for a job with that organization or in that person's business unit. It is purely open-ended, and it is not meant to find out what's open now and would I be a fit for a position that's open right now in your organization. So again, we can talk a bit more about the questions that you can prioritize in order to learn the most that you can from an informational interview. But to let you know, again, this is a named genre within the United States, North America, and people who are in the working world have made use of it in their careers. So if you use that term, it's something that will be recognized.
Yeah, thank you. And so, I guess speaking of learning, how do you make it clear what skills or information you're looking to gain from an informational interview? How can you establish a rapport in a comfortable, non-awkward way?
Non-awkward, yes. Let's see if we can do that. First of all, if you're lucky, and this is the way many informational interviews start, you have a bridge person who has connected you with that person to talk with. So maybe it's your academic advisor who says, oh, you're interested in responsible tech in the government space? I know Riva Schwartz, who works in responsible AI, responsible tech at NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, just outside of Washington, D.C. in Gaithersburg. And she has a linguistics background. That's a person you should connect with if you also have a linguistics background and you want to see how can a linguist work in responsible tech? And how did Riva, who is a real person who is amazing in this space, how did she work on the AI risk assessment that was published by NIST and is in use right now? How did she work in a team with developers, computer engineers, and other scientists and take on a role as the socio-technical expert on that team? So if you have that bridge person who says, you can talk to this person I know and you can use my name, I can set you up. I can send an introductory LinkedIn message, an introductory email, I'll connect you. That's really great if you have that happen. And that's your natural on-ramp to a conversation with that person, because you can start off that interview with Riva or whoever you're talking with and say, well, it's so good to finally meet you. I'm really grateful that Dr. Johnston set us up. I've heard so much about your work from her, and I'm very interested in finding out, how do you use your linguistic skills when you're on a team of computer engineers, computer scientists, and other developers? Can you tell me about that? So that way you are building rapport through that mutual connection, and you're setting up the interview with an agenda of what you would like to know. And it's very important to be prepared for these interviews. This is the most important way to show respect for that person who is taking time out of their busy work schedule. You will prepare in advance a list of those questions. You will prioritize those questions. And in case anybody needs some inspiration, I do have a document that I can share. We can put in the show notes. We can put in the YouTube notes or comments. And it's a Google Doc that lists areas of rapport building questions, questions about skills, questions about organizational work culture, questions about the sector. So that can be a useful resource document. You can also Google this stuff or search this stuff with your favorite browser. So if you don't have a bridge person though, Milan, I'm sure you're wondering, how can I do that if I'm just reaching out through LinkedIn and I don't know this person? First of all, I would start with the closest degree of familiarity to you, that first degree connection. So friends, family, and importantly, alumni from your current university institution. Alumni are fantastic, for the most part, about connecting with students from their institution and reaching a hand back to help and talk to students about how they made the bridge from coursework to career, and letting you know how you can do that too. So you can use LinkedIn as a research tool, put in your undergraduate institution name and whatever keyword is of interest to you, or keywords. It could be responsible tech, it could be responsible AI, it could be ethical AI. So I would put in Georgetown University and linguist and responsible AI, if that's of interest to me. And that would produce a list of alumni, and I could look through it and see, oh, when did these people graduate? What departments? Were they, from the linguistics department, or did they have a background in linguistics at another institution? And I would go through that list that LinkedIn provides to me. I would connect with that person, the one who seems like I could have a conversation with, somebody I have a co-membership link with. So again, if you want to have an easy on-ramp to build rapport and not be awkward, it's very easy to start out with an alum from any institution you belong to and say, when you start that conversation, if they accept your invitation to have an informational interview, usually 20 minutes or so with option to extend if your interviewee says it's okay, then you can say, I'm so glad I can talk to you. We're both in the same department. We are both in the same program. You graduated in X year. I saw in your LinkedIn profile that you studied Y. You do that background research on that person through LinkedIn to find out what can connect you even more to that person. So again, key thing is to do a lot of prep work and to lay the groundwork so you can have a productive conversation and, show the respect to that person that you've prepared, you've prioritized your questions. And so you have a semi-structured conversation where you are the one driving the questions and keeping to time. How's that for non-awkward? Do you have a follow-up about that?
Thanks. That's really helpful advice. So we just heard a bit about how to scope out the space of responsible tech careers. Deb, we want to ask now about majors and courses you think we should be involved in now. Given the skills that you mentioned earlier, what should a college student now study? What should we major in? Should we get minors, certificates? You say that we need many skills, but sometimes our majors only teach one.
Yeah, this is great. And again, here is my plea to universities to start revolutionizing your education. Before I start, I just want to echo what Professor Johnston has said here. I host a show on ethics and technology, and I'm spending a lot of time talking about the job market right now. And I had a interview on that show with the CEO of a company called Hire Club. And I asked him, what is the biggest mistake that a new undergraduate makes when applying for their first job? And he guesses about what he said? I'll spoil it for you. He said applying for the job, right? Because in the context of a job application process where you put a resume into a resume scanner, and the resume scanner and the hiring manager look for a match between the skills and the job and the person, they're getting maybe sometimes 1,000 resumes. The way to rise to the top is to know the hiring manager, or to know somebody who knows somebody who knows somebody who can say to the hiring manager, hey, pull this person out. Because the principle on which people hire is the principle of trust, right? They want to know that they can trust you to do the job. Hiring is really expensive. Training somebody for a job is really expensive. And if you can say, hey, this person is certified by somebody who you trust, they're going to look at that. They're going to look at that very closely. If we export this and we think about this principle of trust in terms of thinking about how you should build a major, let's understand that you want somebody to trust that you have the skills to do the job. Now, there's a fundamental distance here because the field of responsible and ethical technology, or responsible ethical technology jobs, is not well defined. So think about a job that might be better defined, right? Project manager. It's a pretty well-defined job with pretty well-defined skills. It's a title. What title would you look for if you were doing a job search for responsible ethical technology jobs? One doesn't really jump to mind the same way it does project manager, community relations associate, right? And so what you're looking at is people who may not exactly know what they are hiring for. They may not have that list of things that are really codified, set down industry standards. And the best way to get to the top of that list is to cultivate as many potential skills in as many potential areas as you can. Don't forget that in the field of ethical and responsible technology, especially with this new reorg, you're not going to be sitting in a team of people who are all ethical technologists, responsible technologists, DEI professionals. You may be sitting in a team where you're talking to a project manager, and you're also talking to the developer, and you're also talking to an engineer. And so you need to be able to speak all of those languages. To go back to my earlier comment, you're facing a structural impediment insofar as, because of the way that undergraduate education is set up, you have all of these targets that you have to hit in order to get the qualifications you need to have to finish up your major, all of your GE requirements, right? All of your major coursework, all of your electives, etc. There are those electives, and for those electives, try to find a way to get into some of the basic skills that would compose another major. So if you, for example, want to work on large language models, you can do that as an ethical and responsible technologist. There are a number of jobs right now that are open for people who have skills in sociolinguistics, who have skills in textual communications. But if you want that job, you're going to rise to the top if you know how to speak to the engineer who's building that model. So if you can take that basic coding class, don't be intimidated by it. Take that basic coding class. That will give you a rise to the top. If you take that basic coding class, not only do you have the skills, but you have the capacity to cultivate an element of trust with an instructor who can say, hey, I know that this person has those skills. You may be sitting in a class with other people who are going to be that incoming engineer, right? They can say, I remember this person and they have sociolinguistic skills and they know how to code. So there's a combination of different things here. And I just want to end with one last paragraph that may not seem immediately relevant, but I think will demonstrate its efficacy. There was a study done on successful artists versus artists who really never made their kind of name in art. And the study looked at what differentiated these two groups. And it turned out it wasn't the skill, it wasn't the expertise, it wasn't the technical mastery of art. It was the artists who put their art in a variety of diverse venues. So what does this tell us? It tells us that the more diversity you can cultivate in your background, in your name recognition, the more venues that you can be seen in, the more classes that you can take diversely, the more opportunities you have to not only make a mark, impact, get some recognition across things, get some skills, but also get some recognition about where you might belong. So you're cultivating networks at the same time as you're cultivating skills. And when I teach my class on how to get a job in the context of my master's students, my 5th-year students in data science, one of the things that I tell them is use this last semester to take a class in English literature, to take a class in politics, to take a class in the history of ideas, and use this time right now to look around your peers as well, because your peers are going into this industry too. And they're going to be able at a certain point to say, hey, you know who I remember from my master's program? You know who I remember from that last semester? I remember Katie. And I remember Katie had this particular set of skills. You should look at Katie, or maybe say, hey, Katie, I think that there's a job that might be interesting to you. So there's a way that those kinds of connections actually are conversant with developing the skills at the same time.
Awesome. Thank you, Professor. And it's very clear that it's very important to kind of get those connections in. So going back to Professor Johnston, a lot of college students don't want to reach out to people to do informational interviews because it feels like it's taking something from them. So what do college students have to give to a professional that they want to learn from?
Thanks so much for that, because I see this in the students that I teach all the time, is that they feel that they're making a very heavy ask of a working professional to take 20 minutes of their time, or to have an email exchange to answer a few questions. And while there are better ways to approach people to kind of build up to asking for an informational interview than others. For example, I would say, establish a LinkedIn connection first, exchange messages, follow what that person does on LinkedIn, try to look up their other work before you come right out with that first ask of like, let's have an informational interview. Like, I'm ready to go. So, ramp up a bit, but you do have something to give. Everybody has something to give in this type of informational exchange. So for example, what the professional gets out of it, and I've been on the other side of these interviews, I've done them, I've been part of them, and I've seen, the good, the bad, and the ugly. At its best, the professional gets a chance to feel like they're helping and they're advocating. They are paying forward and paying back the times that they were helped by other professionals when they were finding their current position or learning about the world of work in order to narrow down some of the potential jobs that were of interest to them. They get a chance to reflect on their career in a way that we often don't when we're in the day-to-day of, meetings and deadlines. You get a chance to, as the interviewee, think about advice to give to somebody and deliver that advice. For some people, that's really meaningful to be asked for advice and to feel that somebody is showing interest in them. So as a student or somebody who hasn't joined the workforce or who is transitioning from sector to sector, you are providing your engaged listenership. You're providing an opportunity for reflection and for advice giving. You're also providing respect, because I hope that you are narrowing down your questions, prioritizing them, knowing what you need to know from this person while still keeping an open mind about where they might take the conversation. And you're also following up with a thank you. You are doing that kind of, care afterwards that show that it was meaningful for that person to talk to you for 20 or 30 minutes, or even up to an hour if they, get going and want to extend it. And then it also gives an opportunity for you to show gratitude later on. So a lot of students may also ask, how do you maintain these relationships once you've had this touch point of building up to an informational interview, delivering that interview, and then thanking the person for it? And what I would say to that is that afterwards, whenever you have some kind of milestone event, such as you graduated and you actually got a job, and it may not be in the same area as that person, but try to connect it to what you learned from that person. Say, when you told me to connect with that other professional in that organization, they gave me such good advice. And that actually led to me finding this position that I applied for and I got. So thank you for that. Make sure whenever you've implemented some of their advice that you just reach back to them and say, thanks for telling me X. That was so helpful. And it's really given me a new impression about this kind of position that's available, this kind of organization and the wide array of work that they do that I had no idea about. So by doing that, it's multifunctional. You're not only showing gratitude to someone and thanking them for something that they did, but you are also reaching back to, touch base with them when you don't have another ask. So it's not like, we had such a great interview. Now I want to follow up and have another interview, or now I want to connect you with a friend of mine who could really benefit from talking to you. No, you're following up to show that gratitude and show how their advice has affected you, and it's free of any other string. And if you're on the receiving end of that kind of email, it feels really good, because often when faculty advisors, they write lots of recommendation letters, they give lots of advice, and then students go out and they get jobs and we don't hear, what happened. Like, we and other working professionals love to hear what happened. What was something good about my advice that helped somebody to do something? That feels really good. So as students, you have all of that to give. And it's something that you can nurture, and it's also very beneficial for you because you become known as the kind of person who follows up, who is caring and respectful, and somebody that you never know that working professional might think of for another opportunity. They might even reach out to you for assistance in some other area of their life. I mean, the world can be very small in these working worlds, especially in, responsible tech. So presenting yourself as that kind of person and developing a reputation for being engaged, respectful, prepared, with prioritized questions and prompt responses, and free of strings, emails and LinkedIn messages, that is a really good reputation to polish and carry forward.
We have time for one more brief question. So, sorry, Katie.
I was just saying thank you for that advice. It's really helpful. So circling back to the cross-organizational role of ethics professionals in new companies, if there's an ethics person on development teams, how would that person interact with the engineers and the project managers? And could every size company really have space for an ethics person on every team?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think that what we're talking about when we're talking about ethics professionals are people who can actually work across teams. And this makes sense on the basic level of how ethics can work, right? If you don't have your product team talking to your development team, there's going to be gaps in how those things fit together. The role of an ethics person should be to start at the beginning of the process. When I started thinking about and writing about and developing conversations about ethics and technology, one thing became very clear to me from the beginning. You cannot build on ethics after you develop a company or after you develop a product. It cannot be latched on at the end as a kind of prosthetic. You have to start at the beginning. And so when we're talking about ethics professionals, we're talking about people who can be conversant across different teams. Why? Because an organization, in order to create a product, has to have those teams talking to one another. And if those teams are talking to one another in order to develop a product, and if that product is going to be ethical, responsible, thought through, without bugs, without problems, without biases, without with things that are adversarial to certain user groups or orthogonal to the ends and needs of some of the users, those things have to be thought through ahead of time. So the role of an ethics person is to really debug things before the bugs even happen. So you want to think about, well, what is the consequence of this going to be for if we build it a certain way for example, people who identify as women? What is the consequence of this product going to be when we export it to India? What is the consequence of this product going to be when the administration comes out with these 5 predictable pieces of regulation? What is a consequence of this product going to be for the accessibility for people who have vision issues or who have mobility issues? And so those things should be thought of anticipatorily. Now, you talked about a a project manager. The product manager is really key here. The product manager is the person who oversees an entire product. So if you're thinking about this as an ethics person, you want to have the product conversation in conversation with the development. And for those who are not yet in the workforce, what I'm really talking about here is organizational structure and the silos that organically crop up when you have different people working on different parts of a project. So if you can imagine an engineering team who's figuring out how to, for example, do the Q&A dimension of a product on the back end, that person may never until the end have a conversation with somebody who's thinking about this from a user experience point of view. The role of the ethics person is to bring those two things together and then to create templates so that this can be operationalized, so that every time you're developing a new product as a product manager, you don't have to think through these ethical questions from the beginning. There are ethical questions and ethical templates that are already thought through from the beginning so that the process is streamlined, so that you don't get to the end of a product and say, oh my goodness, for example, my product Gemini is in the attempt to create a more diverse set of image generating avenues, now generating, for example, Nazis of color. Nazis who have different skin tones, for example, right? You want to think through those questions from the beginning. How do we balance out our needs for representational diversity in our image with the needs of factual representation about the past? And the ethics person should be involved in that. And they should be talking to the people who say, here's what we can do on the engineering side. And the person who says, here's the user experience, right? And here's the person who says, well, here's actually the models that we're working with. And the person who says, here's the time by which we need to ship this product. The ethics person needs to be involved in all of those conversations, and not just involved in those conversations, but able to think, again, anticipatorily about the consequences and about what might come up, and then to be able to create templates about how to do that. And that's a cross-functional job, which is why I say that it is in your best interest to be able to speak multiple languages, in your best interest to be able to understand how these people talk across these different avenues and across these different sectors of industry, and be able to speak those multiple different languages in order to best and most comprehensively create those dialogues and those structures. And this is a real opportunity, because truly, I think that at the core of our ethical concerns are, how do we talk across divisions? How do we talk across political divisions? How do we talk across the silos and divisions that happen in industry? How do we talk to people across different groups? How do we get all of the stakeholders together, right? That is one core definition of responsible technology, getting all the different stakeholders together and being able to ensure that the product works across multiple different and diverse sectors for multiple different dimensions. And that is the role of an ethics worker. And so when you're in that ethics team, you want to cultivate the skills to be able to talk to all of those different people, because that is the role that you're going to be able to fill.
So we have come to the end of our time together. And I think it's really fascinating. What I've learned from conversations with both of our guests and from our students' questions is that not only is responsible tech in some ways a new space, but it's a space that just went through a new transition. And that really makes it, speaking to Professor Johnston's expertise, a communicative space. This is a space where we need to be asking questions of each other, learning to speak each other's language, informational interviewing within this space. So I really want to thank Professor Donig and Professor Johnston for being part of this call today. Your help will reach many students, because if this is a conversation that you were interested in and you have more questions and you want to know more, I want you to know that the All Tech is Human University Network specializes in these sorts of conversations. We bring this sort of knowledge, these sorts of experiences to your campus. And we also get together across campuses. We're on over 50 different campuses, 13 countries, all continents except Antarctica. And we are having conversations across all of those campuses about these very topics. So come back, join us, get in touch with me. I'm Stephen Kelts. I'm the director of the All Tech is Human University Network. Get in touch with me, Stephen@alltechishuman.org, and we'll get you tied into this. So thanks one more time to our guests and our questioners. Professor Donig and Professor Johnston, thank you. And to our student questioners, thank you as well.